Dear EAHIL colleagues, I think we're ready to start. Hello and welcome to the third webinar from the series of webinars delivered to you by EAHIL Online Continuing Professional Development Pilot Program. My name is Vesna Cafuta, the moderator of today's webinar and an EAHIL Council member for Slovenia. It's my very great honor to introduce today's speaker, Julie Glanville. In this one-hour webinar, Search Filters, What Are They Good For?, Julie will review how to find filters, how to assess their quality, and occasions when filters may or may not be helpful. Julie Glanville is Associate Director at York Health Economics Consortium at the University of York, UK. Since 2008, she has coordinated consortium's information and review services to customers who require literature searches and reviews of all types. Julie is a qualified librarian who has been working in the field of systematic reviews for more than 20 years and has also developed and published several search filters. She is a co-convener of the Cochrane Information Retrieval Methods Group, a co-author of the Cochrane Handbook chapter on searching for evidence, and a co-editor of the YSSG Search Filter resource. Before I give the word to Julie, I would like to inform you that she will be answering questions during the presentation and in the last 5 minutes of the webinar. So please use the chat box in the left bottom corner for posting questions. Julie, welcome, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Vesna. That's a really kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are. I'm very happy to be able to talk to you today about search filters. I have to declare my interest. I think Vesna's already summarised some of the roles that I've had which have involved search filters. So obviously I'm somebody who's been using search filters for a long time. I do training on search filters, and I'm also the co-author of several search filters. I'm also the co-organiser of co-manager of the ISSG search filter resource. So these are my declarations of interest in this topic. Okay, so hopefully fully transparent in all respects. Okay, so today we're going to look at what search filters are, how we can find them, how we can assess their quality, and some thoughts about when we might use them. So first of all, let's think about what a search filter is. There are probably many definitions, but the essential aspect of search filters are that they're collections of search terms designed to retrieve specific sets of records. And search filters can cover or can try to retrieve quite a large sort of selection of types of records. So the ones that are the type of search filter that I've mostly worked with are those that try to retrieve studies on specific study designs, such as randomized controlled trials or systematic reviews. But you will also find search filters that try to retrieve all of the records on a particular topic, such as kidney disease. You'll also find filters to pick up particular types of populations, such as children, and there are many other strategies, search filters, that will focus on other features or themes. The rationale behind this interest in sets of search terms that will retrieve particular types of record is to save us time. So somebody spends a lot of many days, many weeks perhaps, working to provide us with a tool which they hope will offer a consistent performance over time and save us the time of having to develop search filters ourselves. And the other differential that I'd like to try and note at this stage is that search filters are probably different from the database limits that we find in databases. So search filters are sets of search terms. Database limits are operational facilities within databases, such as the ability to limit by year or language. So just to show you what a filter might look like, I've given you an example here of one of the SIGN, the Scottish Intercollegiate Guidelines Network filters. This is their filter for systematic reviews. And what you can see in this filter is a set of search terms to try and find systematic reviews, and they try to find systematic reviews in various ways by using words that express the idea of, say, meta-analysis, or use subject headings such as review literature as topic. They also then use search terms to find words that might indicate that a review was carried out. So we have here some of the database names in lines 8 to 15, some of the database names that you might see mentioned in a search as part of a systematic review. Then below that there are some of the techniques used in systematic reviews, things like hand searching, and then other words that are sort of signs a systematic review might have been undertaken, such as selection criteria and data extraction. And then there are some exclusions at the bottom of the filter. So this is a set of search terms that the authors have developed to try and find systematic reviews consistently across various other searches. How do we use filters? We usually bolt them on to another search, so they are usually an additional concept that we introduce to make a search more focused. So for example, if we are doing a search for breast cancer randomized controlled trials, we would probably develop our subject search for breast cancer, and then we could think about adding on a search filter to find RCTs that somebody else has developed. And then we would combine our search filter with the breast cancer search terms. And the second example I've given you on the slide is an approach to find systematic reviews of physiotherapy for low back pain. In this example, we have a set of search terms, probably to find physiotherapy. We have a set of search terms in set 2 to find low back pain. And then the systematic review filter, such as the one we've just looked at, would be the third concept, and then we would combine all three concepts to find systematic reviews of physiotherapy for low back pain. So if that's what a filter is, how can I find these things? We can find filters in many database interfaces. PubMed, for example, has the clinical queries and other search filters built into the software, so that we don't have to type the searches in. We can just make use of the hard-coded filters that have been added to the interface. Ovid also has a range of search filters within the interface. We can also look and identify filters from the Intertask Information Specialist Subgroup Search Filters resource. This is a resource on the web which is free to access and has been available now for well over 5 years, and we try to identify and gather together references to search filters that have been published. And these tend to be search filters that focus on methodological issues. I've got a question here from Amanda Warner about the search filters in Ovid versus PubMed. I think there are some differences, Amanda. I don't know the full differences, but there are definitely, I think not all of the search filters in PubMed are also in Ovid. Sorry, I can't answer that in detail. There's also, the ISSG search filters resource is a methods focuses on study design filters, so RCTs, systematic reviews. There is also an increasing interest, I think, in sets of subject search terms, so-called search blocks, and there is a site which I've given you the link to there, where you can go and you'll find a list of various resources which will give you access to subject searches. So, for example, search blocks to find breast cancer topics. So the next slide shows you the entry page to the ISSG Search Filters resource, and you will see that the types of study design are listed here on the entry page. So if you're interested in trying to find search filters of prognosis, you would click on this entry here and it would take you to another web page with a list of the references to prognosis search filters that have been developed. And then down at the bottom here you can see some other links through to critical appraisal tools, filter methods papers, surveys of filter performance, and other things around search filters. This is one of the pages that you could link to. So this is a page listing search filters to identify qualitative research. And the thing I'd like to point you to first of all, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but the very first piece of information at the top of this page is a review of search filter performance. So if you encounter a page like this with lots of filters listed, you might want to read the reviews at the top, because these might help you to identify which of these many filters are actually the best performing. So here, before you perhaps look at these, you might want to read this paper, which has examined how well some of these qualitative review filters, qualitative research filters work. And most of our pages are set up in this way, with the filter performance information at the top and then the individual filters down below. Sorry, I should at this point have acknowledged my co-organisers for this resource, Carol Lefevre and Kath Wright. So I can realise you can't see my cursor, so the information I'm pointing to, the performance review, is the reference right at the top with the authors Dejan and Giacomini and Simeonov and Smith. That's a review of filter performance.
Julie, excuse me, you can use the pointer at the top above the slides. You can see this. Yes, that's the one.
That's right. Hopefully you can see the green. So let's think about search filter design. There are, as you can see from this listing just of the filters for qualitative research, if you were wanting to use a filter, you have a selection decision. So one of the things that we need to think about is, how are we going to choose between the filters that are on offer to us? Not all search filters may be equally effective or well designed, and the sort of seminal paper on the methods for search filters, produced by Michelle Jenkins in 2004, suggests that there have been generations of filter design, and the first generation, she suggests, was pragmatically designed search filters, where people just developed search filters and published them. Second generation filters were seen as those where the performance of the search filters was tested on a gold standard set of known relevant records. And then Michelle suggests that the third generation would be those that were developed from a gold standard set of relevant records and then tested on either the same but ideally a different gold standard. So one of the ways of looking at the search filters that we have on offer is to think, well, there's also some idea of progression of design improvement in these. The idea of generations brings with it, I think, a feeling that probably the design is improving over time, and as people adopt these different approaches, perhaps their methods are becoming more robust and maybe more reliable and rigorous. So one of the questions we can ask ourselves as we're looking at search filters is maybe, what generation does the filter belong to? But really what we're trying to tease out when we look at a search filter and we read the paper that describes the design of the search filter is, was the filter developed in an appropriate way? Is it likely to capture the type of studies that I'm interested in? And was it tested in an appropriate way? Was it tested enough so that we we can rely on it to perform consistently in the future. So with search filter design, we need to be aware of what the perspective is from which the filter was developed. And what we will usually find is that filters are focusing on issues or performance issues such as sensitivity and precision. So if a filter is focused on being as sensitive as possible, what it really means is that the authors were trying to develop a filter that would find as many of the known relevant studies as possible. If the authors were emphasising precision in their strategy, then really they were trying to make the search as precise as possible and to exclude as many irrelevant studies as possible. So trying to make sure that we didn't retrieve a lot of studies that are not actually on the topic we're interested in. So when we're looking at a filter and we're reading the paper that describes the filter or the notes about the filter, what we're trying to decide is the filter relevant to our question, and does it address the perspective that we're interested in? Are we interested in finding as many relevant studies as possible, or are we really interested in finding some relevant studies and excluding as many irrelevant studies as possible? What's our perspective on what we want to achieve? And the bottom line of our assessment is that we want to identify and use filters that are both effective, i.e. find the studies that you're interested in, and also suitable for your context, which is the resources you have available to process the records. So if I'm presented with a selection of search filters, such as we've seen with the qualitative research filter page, how am I going to choose between them? So one of the things we've already encountered is that somebody else may have already done this choosing or assessment job for us. So somebody else may have already carried out a performance assessment of the filters that are available. So one of the first things I suggest is that when we're looking for a search filter, we look at the performance reviews. And we'll go and look at the performance reviews in the next slide. We can also think about probably the fact that when we are reading search filter papers, we can probably make some unstructured assessments of search filters. We can read a paper and come to some judgments without needing perhaps a detailed structure to help us weigh up the pros and cons of the filters. But we might also be interested to know that there are, just as with many other types of study design, there are critical appraisal instruments which can help us to make formal, structured assessments of papers that report maybe one or two filters. So this would help us with standardising our analysis of each of the filter papers and making sure that we try and do a fair comparison of what the different filters are like and how they've been developed and the information reported about them. So there are various ways to look at performance, and that range from reading somebody else's performance to carrying out unstructured assessments to carrying out structured critical appraisals. So this slide shows you an example of a review of search filter performance. This is a Cochrane methodological review which appraises the performance of search filters which have been developed to identify diagnostic accuracy studies in Medline and Embase. And the authors of this paper have identified a range of DTA filters and have then looked at the performance data and reviewed it and come to a conclusion about how well DTA search filters perform. So this type of review obviously represents a huge amount of effort and is a sort of a very useful time-saving, is very useful and time-saving for us because we don't have often I guess, the time to sit and read several studies, assess them, compare them, and come to a conclusion about which is the best filter for us. So performance reviews can be incredibly time saving. If you don't find a performance review, then these are some of the checklists that are available for helping you to read and appreciate and critically appraise published search filters. So the first publication is by Michelle Jenkins and was, I guess, sort of an early schema, an early attempt to think about what the important issues are in strategy design. And then the other two are more sort of detailed appraisal checklists, and the paper that I'm a lead author on there, the second one, is quite a hand-holding tool. It sort of assumes that people who are appraising the filters don't have much experience, and we try to hold the appraiser's hand through the issues that we felt were important about when critically appraising a search filter. And then the third critical appraisal tool by Back and colleagues is really a tool that's sort of aimed at people who've got quite a bit of experience of appraising search filters. So it's a sort of bit more pragmatic, it's a bit more high level, less detailed, less hand-holding. So if you're experienced at appraising, experienced user of search filters and know what you're trying to compare, then Back is probably quicker to use than the ISSG filter critical appraisal checklist. But I think if we look at these appraisal lists, look at these appraisal tools, the questions they're asking are the following. They ask questions. They look at filters from different perspectives. So they look at the context of the filter. What was the filter trying to achieve? And we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a moment. They then address the ways that the filter was designed. How did the authors develop their filter? What what processes did they use to develop their gold standards, identify their search terms, and come to their search strategies? And then how well and in what way did the authors test the performance of their filters? And we'll look at that in more detail in a moment. And then what the critical appraisal tools then focus on is what are the limitations of the search filter, and how well is there any evidence about how the filter performs in comparison to the performance of other filters. So if we think about the first topic first, it's really important when reading a search filter paper to try and work out what the objectives of the filter were. So first of all, what was the filter trying to find? Was it trying to find randomized controlled trials, economic studies, some other study design, or some other issue? And then what is the focus of the filter? And usually the authors, especially filters written today, the authors should be really clear about what they were trying to achieve with their filter. So the types of focus of the filters that you see expressed are that the filter was sensitivity maximizing, finding as many relevant studies as possible, precision maximizing, finding as few irrelevant studies as possible, and with the trade-off that the filter might miss some relevant studies. Or was the filter aiming for some sort of balance between sensitivity and precision, being both quite sensitive and quite precise? But with that balance probably comes the fact that you might be missing some relevant studies. And then some filters are focused on specificity, and this measure is about successfully not retrieving studies that you think are irrelevant. When considering the objectives of a filter, we also want to think about what database or interface it was designed for, and the date when the filter was developed. So just to give you an example of a context issue, this is the PubMed systematic reviews filter that's built into the PubMed interface. And in red you can see the objective of this filter. And this filter starts off, it's called the systematic reviews filter, and it starts off with saying it's aiming to retrieve systematic reviews and meta-analyses and reviews of clinical trials. And that's sort of quite encouraging, because that sounds like it's going to be finding systematic reviews. But then the description of the objective of the filter broadens out quite a lot. So what you end up with is probably a filter that's quite a lot broader than systematic reviews. So if you were using this filter to focus down a search onto systematic reviews, your end result, your studies that are retrieved by this search filter might actually be a lot broader than just systematic reviews. So it's always important to not just perhaps sort of trust the name of the filter, but to sort of read a bit more behind it, and to try to judge whether it's really meeting your particular focus. So if we move on to thinking about the design of search filters, what we hope to see in search filter papers where the authors have described their methods of search strategy design is some information about identifying a gold standard. And the reason why we're interested in gold standards is because they can be used both for developing the strategy and for testing out the performance of the strategy. So gold standards, or quasi-gold standards, or reference sets are collections of known relevant records. They might be a set of randomized controlled trials, or a set of systematic reviews, or a set of questionnaires, or some other study design. Or if you're doing a search filter, or your search filter topic is some other thing, it might be a set of records about children with asthma, or a set of records that are about renal cancer. So what we want to know is from the search filter paper is how the authors went about identifying a gold standard. Because what we want to know is how representative that gold standard is of the type of record that the authors are trying to find or to develop the filter to capture. So there are many ways of developing gold standards, and just some examples are things like hand searching. This is the gold standard way of developing gold standards. Hand searching journals or databases. Relative recall is another method which we'll look at in a moment, or the authors might report another method. So what we're looking at is, what we're looking for is a clear description of how the gold standard was identified, some sort of assessment of whether the gold standard was large enough, and whether there are any limitations to the gold standard from the perspective that we're approaching from. So, hello Ruth, I'm just about to tell you about relative recall in a moment, in a couple of slides' time. So, in terms of identifying gold standards, if we are, I'll talk about that in a sec, Isla. Hand searching journals involves probably selecting a number of relevant journals, being very clear about the selection criteria for how you're going to carry out the hand searching, then carrying out some sort of cover to cover, beginning to end assessment of the online version of the documents or the hard copy. And these can then be the hand searching can be carried out in various different ways. And the benefits of hand searching is that it's high sensitivity. We can also hand search database records by, again, choosing a batch of records, hand searching and selecting the most relevant studies, and then we can also do relative recall. So let's talk about, EAHIL has said, is author accumulated personal library of relevant papers adequate? I guess it's a quasi gold standard. It's a sort of a gold standard, but I suspect that if you wrote a paper and sent it to a journal and said that this was your own personal library of relevant studies, the referee would probably come back to you and say, how can you demonstrate that you haven't missed some relevant studies? Excuse me. So I think I'd say it was probably a weaker set of relevant records. I mean, it might be that you've accumulated your personal library through lots of SDIs and current awareness searches, and you could then show people the current awareness searches you've been running, and that would then justify your set of records. Thanks, Isla. Excuse me. Okay, so relative recall is an approach that uses the systematic review, the results of a systematic review, as a quasi-gold standard. So in this lovely diagram here, you have on the left, you have in the clouds, you have a range of different approaches to identifying studies, and the results of our extensive searching for our systematic review will go into an EndNote library or a reference manager library, be deduplicated, and then a process of selection will go on for the systematic review, and a lot of records will be excluded, and some records will be included in the systematic review. And what we have down in the bottom right hand corner is a gold standard made up of, or a quasi-gold standard made up of, the records that were eligible for that systematic review. So the gold standard is only sort of known at the end of the systematic review, and is really only as good as the searches that have been carried out to inform the systematic review. So if we look at my search strategy, which is rather an insensitive search strategy, it's a sort of an example approach, you would think, well, probably the gold standard wasn't very good. But if you saw a much larger strategy with a lot of synonyms, and these were run in all the databases you can see there, plus all these other additional activities were undertaken, you might then say, well, there is a chance that the eligible records in that SAS systematic review are representing some form of a gold standard. So the relative recall gold standard makes use of systematic reviews that have been informed by extensive searching undertaken in several databases and using different methods. And the best systematic reviews to harvest gold standards from are probably those that have not actually used a methods filter within the searches. And ideally they'll just be the subject strategy. So the next issue around design is how the search terms in the filters were developed, and the ways that authors identify search terms to go into filters can be achieved in many different ways, and these are just some of the things that you see in search filter papers. So some people adapt published strategies, some people ask experts for suggested keywords, some people use database thesauri, some people extract terms from relevant records, extract terms from the gold standard, or carry out statistical analyses either of records from the gold standard or other sets of records. So there are lots of ways of identifying terms, and there's no one way that's sort of accepted as the only way to do it. Once the authors have identified individual search terms and phrases, individual search words and phrases, they will then have to make selections, and the selection process should also be described in the paper. So selections may be guided by some form of frequency analysis, so authors might choose the most frequently occurring words, or they might introduce words that appear in more than 50% of records. They might introduce some sort of cut-off. They might select using specific levels of sensitivity and precision, or they might look for words that are in close proximity. And they should also, perhaps, if they're proposing truncation, discuss how they decided on the truncations to use. And then once the terms have been selected, we will be looking for some sort of description of the way that the concepts in the filter have been combined, and we would be making judgments, I guess, about whether the concepts were combined in a reasonable way. So we've moved from search terms to search strategies, i.e. terms in combination, and usually authors will describe an iterative process of testing out sets of search terms to then be able to report on how well those search strategies perform in finding relevant studies. And ideally what we're looking for is the authors to describe to us the ways that the strategies have been tested, and we're ideally looking for testing on more than one set of gold standard records. So often we will find that the first set of tests is conducted on what's called a test set, and this is often the set of records that the search has been developed from. So what you're trying to do at this stage is to make sure that the strategy is performing reasonably well in finding relevant studies from the records it was developed from. And then there might be a process of strategy development, and then what we'd be looking for is subsequent testing on additional test sets, and then finally testing on what's called a validation set. And the validation set is a set of records that has not been used to develop the filter. And the reason for this is to see if the performance holds up over different sets of records, and to test for generalizability of the filter in similar records and in different records, and hopefully also in the real world. So thanks, Isla. Isla's asked about what's the difference between a test set and a gold standard set. It's a good question. I guess it's something that you would define at the beginning of your paper. So a gold standard set of records is a set of relevant records, and you might subdivide the gold standard set up into various test sets and possibly a validation set. And I've got a diagram coming up, Isla, that I hope will show this. Okay, so this is the basic sort of testing of performance. So here is a gold standard set of records, and in the early days, in the second generation search filters, people would derive a search filter from this gold standard. Here's a search filter, and then they would test it out on this gold standard. And the problem with this is that because this filter was developed from this gold standard, it will perform well, because it's finding the records that we developed it from. It's a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So Isla's asking if her personal library, even if it's not adequate to be a gold standard, could perhaps be a test set. And I think that's, again, a very good idea, Isla. I think, again, people would still want you to be justifying why it's a helpful test set, but I certainly don't see any problem with it being one of the test sets, in my opinion. So here we've got a better approach. Here's our gold standard set of records. We've got 1,000 records here. And what we've done in this example is we've split it into two. And here we've got what I call a derivation set, but it's a test set. And we've got 400 records in here. And we're using this to develop our filter and test it. And then once we're happy our filter's doing well, we can then test out our filter on this second set of records the subset of 600 records from the gold standard that have so far not featured in our development. And we can then test out our gold standard in the set of 600 records on the right. Hello Hilda. Hilda's asking which method would you use to split the gold standard into sets? I guess I'd probably do it randomly. You might stratify it by years and then do random selection from sort of years, or you might stratify it in other ways, but I guess ideally you'd want some sort of random selection. And you can use random number generators to, you can say I've got 1,000 records, give me 400 numbers from those 1,000 records and then you give me 600, you can do random number generation so that you can then just choose the records that correspond to the numbers the random number generator offers. Oh, lovely, thank you, Amanda. Amanda's just saying she's written a blog post on the topic of randomizing records. That looks I'm sure that will be really useful. Thank you. Okay, and then we've got another example of even more sort of broken down testing and validation. So here we've got our gold standard, and we've split it up into 3 sets of 300, 300 and 400 records. And we've got 2 test sets, and we've got a derivation set where we've developed our strategy, and then we've got 2 subsets where we might validate our strategy, or we might use one as a second test set after we've improved our strategy, and then do a final validation on a 3rd set. And then over in the cloud, the orangey cloud on the right, we've got some testing out of performance in the real world. Okay, and then we've got another option, which is, this is the real world testing. So if we developed our search filter, you'll remember that we had this very basic search for breast cancer, tamoxifen and RCTs. What we could do, once we developed our search filter, is test out how well our search filter performs in finding out the eligible studies from our systematic review that are in Medline. This would give us another way of doing some real-world testing. So let's think about the performance measures. I've included this slide not because I'm going to go through it in any detail, but really just so you've got the calculations to hand if you ever want to come back and look at this. So the calculations I'm offering you here is if we have a gold standard set of records that we want to find, 100 records say, our strategy finds 900 records, then our retrieval is 1,000 records, and the performance of our search strategy, if our search strategy retrieves 90 of the gold standard, then its sensitivity is 90%. It finds 90 out of 100 gold standards. And if it finds 600 of the non-gold standard records, we can work out the precision as 90, the number of relevant records, divided by 690, the total number of records retrieved. So the precision in this case is 13%. Now 13% is pretty good precision, and one of the things that you might want to consider before you choose any filters is what sort of sensitivity and precision you would be happy with. And then another measure here is the number needed to read, which is usually calculated as 1 over the precision. And this figure is often seen as a more helpful way of assessing the amount of work that will be needed to process the records. So in this case, I'd need to read 7.7 records to find one that was relevant. And I've given you specificity at the bottom. I don't personally find specificity a very useful measure, but Specificity is the number of irrelevant records successfully not retrieved. So the reason I've given you this here is to show you that the specificity of this filter X was 33%. So it didn't retrieve 300 irrelevant records. I don't know that many people find that very helpful. Sorry, somebody's asking 900. The example is a sort of providing you with a universe of records. So in this universe of records, there are 1,000 records, and 900 are not relevant and 100 are relevant. And then against that set of, so this might be a subject search on breast cancer. We find 1,000 records, 900 are relevant and 100 are relevant. And then when we add a filter to that set of records, the retrieval will inevitably go down. We will find 90, this filter performs so that it finds 90 of the gold standard and 600 of the non-gold standard. So the search filter will always is likely always to reduce the precision, and probably always will reduce the sensitivity in some way down from a subject search. Okay, so now we're looking at, we've tested our filter, we've read about what the authors are telling us in terms of the performance of their filter, in terms of the sensitivity and the precision. We now want to look at the paper and see if the authors have discussed any limitations to their research, and also have they compared the performance of their filter to the performance of maybe other relevant published filters. And what you find often is that somebody publishing a new filter will compare it to other filters that they've seen. We're also wanting to read a paper very carefully. It's often the case that people might have proofreading errors even in the filter itself, and then you have all sorts of judgments to make about what you're going to do. We might be looking out for errata in case the authors have changed something or discovered a problem. We might want to read the pre-publication history to see if there's anything useful in that correspondence. And often people might provide further data on a linked site. And then it might be that the paper that we're currently reading was published a few years ago, so we might check out the Intertask ISSG search filter results and see if somebody else has tested out the performance of the filter. So I think you can probably appreciate that this is fairly time consuming. Evaluation and appraisal takes time, and I think that for a lot of us, deciding on what's the most important aspects of the filter will probably take a bit of thought. I don't know what sort of how people value the different aspects of the methods that people have used to develop filters. And you know, if you saw that something wasn't tested very well, but you were happy with all the rest of the design, how would you rate that filter? So if you need, if you are interested in sort of the assistance of a weighting scheme, then I'd point you at the back critical appraisal instrument, which does offer weightings for the different design issues. Just a brief heads up that in the past, at some point, search filters were sort of briefly called quality filters, and really it's just to highlight that they are not quality filters. They don't help you to focus in on the best quality studies. They just help you to focus in on particular records with particular words indicative of study design or some other issue. So the assessment of the quality of the studies remains with the person reviewing that paper. And I guess this is a question you might all like to think about. We read a lot about people who've adapted filters, and I think that one of the things that you should be aware of is that filters that have been developed with specific research methods perform in a particular way. And if you change words in a filter, it probably no longer performs as it did in the author's paper, and you can't claim the same performance as the filter in the paper. And that means that you might need to justify your adaptation with some additional performance data. Okay.
There's a question.
Yeah,
Yes, there's one question from Ayla. How would you reference a strategy that you've used?
I guess that what I would say is that this search, no problem, Isla. I would suggest that, for example, we typically use the NHS-EAHIL Economic Evaluations search filter when we're searching Medline. So we would say in our search write-up that we had used the NHS-EAHIL search filter and give a reference for it. If we were using the Cochrane RCT filter, we would say we're using the Cochrane RCT filter and give the appropriate reference for it. I hope that's okay, Isla. So I guess I'm just suggesting we would cite it just as we cite any other paper. Yes, Anne, you're right. Anne's got a question here about adapting a Medline filter for PubMed. I think you're right. I mean, if you look at people who have provided alternatives for the different for Ovid and PubMed, they will usually be they will have adapted the filter, and you would ideally want to see different. You would want to see the performance data for the different interfaces, and you would expect, I guess, implicitly that precision would be you'd certainly expect precision to be different in the two versions. Yeah, Maria Inti, thank you for that comment. Maria's asked about removing the drugs FS from the Cochrane RCT filter. As I've just said, Maria Inti, the filter, and in particular the Cochrane RCT filter, was developed using research methods, statistical analyses, and it performs with those terms to the level that we've described in the paper. So if you take out the drug FS term, it will perform differently. As you say, in a surgical topic, you might not expect it to have too much impact, but that's your judgment. What you can't say is that it will perform in the same way as the Cochrane RCT filter. Marshall is asking, when you choose a filter, do you also check each term for more recent updates? Yeah, I think, Marshall, that, again, if you're choosing a filter, you're probably buying into the filter as it was published. And I think what this points you to, I'm very sorry. What this points you to is probably a very close examination of older filters. So I guess what I would say is that if you were using the filter and you found some more recent terms, I would add them rather than replacing, but that's my opinion. Is there time limit for validity of a filter? Chantal, thank you for that. I guess that's a question about how fast the topic moves on. I would imagine if you're in a new disease area or in a new study design area or in a topic that is fast moving or where you expect things to have changed, that would mean that filters that were 10 years old might be, you'd be more cautious about using them. Search filters, as you can see, might be a lot of hard work to do, so it's really challenging for people to update them every couple of years. Okay, thank you for the questions. I'm going to move on to the next slide now as I'm running out of time. Okay, limitations of filters. What we find often is that when you bolt on a filter to a subject search, that precision improvements might not be as high as we're hoping. Usually what we're hoping to achieve when we use a search filter is that we will improve precision and not impact too much on sensitivity. And sometimes when we add a filter, we just don't get that improvement. So sometimes you might add a filter and you think, well, that's actually not helping me. I'd actually prefer not to use the filter. And in the case of some types of filters, such as the diagnostic test accuracy filters, if you read that performance review by Benyon earlier on, the conclusion was that in the context of systematic reviews where sensitivity and consistency are important, that the filters just did not perform consistently enough to be recommended for the use in searches for systematic reviews. So I think the next thing, search filters are major pieces of research. Resourcing is often problematic. They can date very rapidly, and you don't see them updated regularly in many cases because they're very resource intensive. And also authors who write about filters, can, like any other study report, not write very well sometimes. So in summary, identifying filters is relatively easy. We have a lot of resources now to help us identifying filters, but the real challenge, I think, increasingly is choosing filters and using them appropriately, because we all have different needs and filters are individual things built from a particular perspective. When we look at a filter paper, we hope that the filter development methods will be clearly reported to help us with our choices. We have to make assessments as we read papers about filters to see whether the design methods appear to be fit for purpose, and we want and expect detailed, adequate performance data to help us choose between filters. I've put some references in case you're interested, and I'll just try and see if there's any final questions. Search filters to use with embase.com. If you look on the ISSG search filter website, you will find search filters by interface. Isla has suggested that Vic or Bremer may have developed some, so that's a good suggestion. Christine is asking, many websites now have search filters or use words as filter. What key points would you suggest for designing filters for websites? I'm not sure I understand the question, Christine. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure what you're suggesting. I would hesitate to say, but I would imagine every website is different and it's going to be very hard to develop generic filters, but I'm not totally sure what your question is. Sorry about that. Jack Tarquin is saying Ovid Embase filters can be easily translated into embase.com filters. Isla is asking, what's the difference between a hedge, a filter and a block? I'm not really sure. For me, a hedge and a filter are the same. A block, I think, is being used as perhaps it's being used from a more pragmatic perspective, i.e. a search block might not be tested and validated or developed from a gold standard. It might just be a set of search terms that you've spent a while developing and that you're offering to share with anybody who thinks it might be useful, but it may not have been validated. Whereas I think a hedge or a filter have some element of design and testing and performance, whereas maybe a search block doesn't, but other people might have other views, and Gudjon is saying that they're going to explain that in the EAHIL workshop. Any other questions?
Yes, Julie, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Thank you very much for this compelling presentation. Slowly we are approaching the end of today's webinar. I can see that questions are coming. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to answer all of them, but the high number of questions clearly indicates that the topic is very interesting. Before we say goodbye, I would like to thank you very much, Julie, for sharing your expert knowledge with the EAHIL community, and thank you for being a part of this EAHIL pilot program. Your contribution is deeply appreciated. And a big thank you also goes to all of you who joined this live webinar. We hope you enjoyed it and that you have gained new knowledge that you can benefit from After the webinar, we will send you a link to the recording and to the slides and to the feedback survey. We would highly appreciate your feedback because based on the evaluation, the EAHIL Online CPD Pilot Working Group will prepare a report and submit it to the EAHIL board. At the EAHIL conference in Dublin this June, the board will decide whether webinars for EAHIL members should continue. Well, let's keep our fingers crossed. Thanks for your time and have a very nice day. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for the questions.